So with these important ambitions in mind, let's turn now to two presentations of research studies that can help us understand the state of English language proficiency among English learner students and how that has looked since the systemic shock of the COVID-19 pandemic began to subside. So I'll shift to our first research study, which I was lucky enough to work on with my colleague David Osman here and others, and I'll share the study's background and design, and then David will talk about findings and implications. So this study was conducted under the REL, and it focused on English learner students in Texas. Now, following Texas's preferred terminology throughout this presentation, we'll use the term emergent bilingual students to refer to students who are currently identified as English learners. So the study was done with the support of many researchers who are listed in the report. I encourage you to check it out on the REL website. And we also worked with some wonderful partners at the Texas Education Agency. So emergent bilingual students make up 10% of the public school students in the US and 20% in Texas. So there are over 1 million students in Texas who are emergent bilingual students. We know that those emergent bilingual students, for them, English language development relies on opportunities to use English in both oral and written modalities. And we also know that the pandemic disrupted their education, particularly for these students who may have had fewer opportunities to practice conversational and academic English. So to better understand this, the Texas Education Agency partnered with us at the REL Southwest to examine how emergent bilingual students' English proficiency may have been influenced by pandemic-related learning disruptions. So to give you some Texas context, the Texas English Language Proficiency Assessment System, or TELPAS, is Texas's statewide annual English language proficiency assessment that measures 4 domains of language: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And TELPAS scores are one of the main components of the decision to reclassify a student as English proficient, which means that the student has reached a level of English proficiency where they're considered proficient and no longer receive emergent bilingual services. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, we all know what that is. And in Texas, in March 2020, just like across the country, most school buildings closed for the remainder of that school year. And by fall 2020, 54% of all Texas students were receiving in-school instruction, and 46% were still receiving remote instruction. TELPAS, specifically the assessment system, was disrupted in the 2019-20 school year by COVID, of course. In the 2020-21 school year, participation rates did jump back up, and 90% of emergent bilingual students in Texas participated then in at least one TELPAS domain. So for this presentation, we're focusing on 2 of our research questions that we discuss in the report. The first is, what are the rates of reclassification of Texas emergent bilingual students and the characteristics of reclassified students in the years spanning the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, so between 2017-18 and through 2020-21? And then to what extent do the proficiency scores of Texas emergent bilingual students in 2020-21 differ from the scores of similar students in 2018-19 prior to the pandemic? So to conduct this study, we used administrative data for current and reclassified emergent bilingual students in Texas. And we specifically focused on students in grades 3 through 12 from 2017-18 through 2020-21. And there may be questions about this selection of grade ranges, so I do encourage you to enter questions into the chat, whether about this or anything else in this presentation or the upcoming one as well. We can discuss them in the Q&A. So back to this, over the first research question, we conducted descriptive statistics. For the second research question, we used propensity score matching to match emergent bilingual students from the 2020-21 school year with a historical comparison group of students from 2018-19, so before the pandemic. And then we used regression methods to compare the TELPAS scores of similar students before and during the pandemic. Now, there are a few limitations to this study. The results shouldn't be interpreted as causal because changes in the TELPAS performance between 2018-19 and 2020-21 cohorts could have been caused by factors other than the pandemic. There were also high rates of missing data, especially in the writing domain. And so that meant that we limited our findings in this presentation to the listening, speaking, and reading domains. And lastly, there were a large amount of missing data from 2019-20, and so that restricted the number of students in our analyses. So now I'll hand it over to David to discuss the findings.
Hi, thank you, Lisa. Our first research question was related to reclassification and reclassification rates. Over the study period, the reclassification rates of emergent bilingual students declined quite a bit. From 2017-18, about 12%, or about 76,000 students were reclassified. But by 2020-2021, 4% of emergent bilingual students were reclassified. This was about 30,000 students. And we think there are three reasons why this decline may have occurred. First, in 2018-19, reclassification relied on TELPAS performance from the prior year. And this was the first year that Texas used a new version of the TELPAS. And this test may have been more difficult than the prior version of the TELPAS. In 2019-20, Texas changed reclassification guidelines. Previously, there were a whole host of alternative English fluency assessments that were allowed to inform reclassification decisions, but in 1920, the number of alternative assessments was reduced pretty substantially. And third, continued lower reclassification rates in 2020-21 could reflect those causes that we discussed previously in the prior 2 years, but they may have also reflected pandemic-related disruptions related to reclassification meetings, processes and decisions that were disrupted by the pandemic. Now, we just saw that the number and percentage of students who were reclassified dropped substantially over the study period, but also the composition of students who were reclassified changed. From 2017-18 to 2020-21, the percentage of emergent bilingual students who attended a school in a major urban school district dropped, as did the percentage who are eligible for the National School Lunch Program, which in Texas we call free and reduced lunch. In other words, fewer students who are economically disadvantaged were reclassified. In addition, across these 4 years, the percentage of reclassified students who spoke Spanish at home and the percentage who identified as Latinx declined. Interestingly, there were no meaningful differences over this time period in any other observed characteristics among these students who reclassified. This included students identified as gifted and talented, students who received special education services, and students who were Asian, Black, or white. Next, we'll go to differences in TELPAS performance before and after the onset of the pandemic. Using some propensity score methods, where emergent bilingual students from 2020-21 were matched with that cohort of emergent bilingual students from 18-19 prior to the pandemic. We found that emergent bilingual students in elementary school, students in grades 3 through 5, had lower scores on all of the TELPAS domains that we examined. The largest difference were in speaking, with an effect size of -0.29, followed by reading with a -0.17 effect, and then listening, -0.14. The story is a little different for students in grades 6 through 8 in middle school. Similar to elementary school students, middle school students' listening scores were much lower in 2020-21 than in 2018-19. The effect size there was -0.3. However, for middle school students, we did not see meaningful differences across the cohorts in speaking or reading. And finally, for emergent bilingual students in high school, grades 9 through 12, differences in the TELPAS score also varied by domain. Interestingly, students in high school in 2020-21 had higher scores on the speaking domain than did similar students in 2018-19, an effect size of +0.18. However, there was no meaningful difference in listening or reading skills across those two cohorts of high school students. We think this work has some application for practitioners and for policymakers. First, leaders at the Texas Education Agency and in Texas school districts may want to consider focusing recovery efforts on middle schools, where students who were in the study when they were in elementary school are now being served. We found that the largest differences in English proficiency scores were in listening, speaking, and reading among students who were at the time in grades 3 through 5. And this suggests a need for really targeted investment of recovery resources for these students now in middle school who were at a critical stage in language development during the pandemic. In addition, policymakers and researchers can really look at, identify, and support strategies that can specifically cultivate these students' speaking proficiency, which appears to have stagnated the most during the pandemic. These skills could be supported through regular opportunities to practice oral language skills and using evidence-based approaches to language and literacy development. The findings related to reclassification indicate that a lot more research may be needed to understand the relationship between reclassification, shifting English proficiency levels during the pandemic, changes in the proficiency assessments, and changes to reclassification criteria. We found that there was a large decline in reclassification rates from 2017-18 through 2020-2021. And we also found that the composition of these students changed, and the changing composition of this group of students really points to a further need for research on how changes to reclassification criteria are related to these student, school, and district characteristics, and specifically how the pandemic may have influenced these groups differently. Texas is in the midst of changing reclassification criteria, and so continued efforts are existing around this effort. So